Now that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, asked him, "Are you the one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it is the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see Jesus." He said to them, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. As he approached the village to which they were going, Jesus continued on as if he were going further. But they urged him strongly, "Stay with us, for it is nearly evening. The day is almost over." So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us?" They got up and returned at once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them assembled together and saying, "It is true, the Lord has risen and has appeared to Simon." Then the two told what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when he broke the bread. Luke 24, verses 13 through to 35, the word of the Lord.
Hey, good morning. My name is Drew. I'm one of the pastors here, and over the last few weeks, we've actually been looking at different stories in the scripture, these moments when people encounter God along the way. We've been looking at different journeys that people have been on, whether it's Abraham or Hagar, or these historical figures, for instance, the people of Israel, or even the Apostle Paul, who ends up having this life-changing encounter with God. And so today we actually continue this theme of someone who meets Jesus along the way in the journey. And so it's very appropriate that today, as we look at answer this question, how do we know Jesus? We're actually going to be looking at this story of these two disciples who the resurrected Jesus. Now, this is what Christians believe. We believe that Jesus actually lived and died and resurrected from the grave. And one of the founders of Christianity, the Apostle Paul, he says that if the resurrection did not happen, then there's no way that we should be following Jesus. And so much of our faith is actually centered around this event, which is why we celebrate today and which is why we're having unlimited ice cream afterwards. All right, so let's actually look at this story. Check out what it says as Luke, who's a historian, writes about this account. He says, "Now that same day, two of them," these are two disciples, "were going to a village called Emmaus." Now, one of the things you might notice about Luke, again, who's a historian, is that he offers these different clues about places and names of people. And the reason why he does that is because he's a great historian. And this is why, again, as Christians, we believe that this was a historical event that really happened. So it says Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem. They were talking with each other about everything that had happened. And in a moment, you're going to hear about what had happened. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up and walked along with them. I mean, isn't this cool? Jesus, these two disciples are walking, and Jesus comes alongside them, but they were kept from recognizing him. Now, some of you might be wondering, like, how in the world did you not recognize Jesus? He just resurrected. Now, could you imagine, for these two disciples, they have no grid for Jesus. They had just witnessed Jesus get executed. There's no grid for Jesus being alive. Moreover, have you ever had those moments when you think you recognize someone, but you're not quite sure? I remember I was downtown with a few friends, and as we were walking around downtown on a bench in a park, my friend said to me, "Oh my goodness, there's Stan Lee." Stan Lee, who's the creator of the Marvel comics. Stan Lee, of course, who has his silver hair, the sunglasses, and so he's very conspicuous looking. Now, I didn't know what he looked like or anything, so he pointed him out, and so I was like, okay, well, I'm gonna go ask him. So I went up to him and I said, "Sir, are you Stan Lee?" He looks up at me, he's like smoking his cigarette, and he goes, "No." I was like, okay. So I went back and I told my friend, I'm like, "That's not Stan Lee, man." He goes, no, that's totally Stan Lee. He was just lying to you. But the disciples are kept from recognizing him. They don't quite know because it's not in their grid. It's not in their paradigm. Now look at what happens. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" They stood still, their faces downcast. One of them, named Cleopas, again, another clue, if you're wondering whether this is a historical account that's true or not, asked him, "Are you the only one visiting Jerusalem who does not know the things that have happened there in these days?" This was the talk of the town. Now, here's the thing. Different non-Christian historians like Josephus, who's Jewish, or Tacitus, who is Roman, they would write about Jesus. Now, what these disciples are about to share with Jesus about what happened, this is the same account that Josephus and Tacitus would write about. And he basically says, "What things?" he asked. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet, powerful in word and deed before God and all the people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him." Now again, this was part of the historical record. Non-Christian historians even would write about Jesus being crucified at the hands of Pontius Pilate. But we had hoped that he was the one who was going to redeem Israel. Now, what does that mean? You see, throughout the history of the people of Israel, they had longed for a Messiah, an anointed one, someone who would come who would deliver them from their captivity. Throughout the history of Israel, it's replete with people who are in captivity, whether it's in bondage of slavery in Egypt, whether it's in exile to Babylon, or whether it's under Roman oppression and rule. So the people of Israel, their thought of a Messiah was someone who was going to come with guns blazing, someone who was going to come with a strong and mighty armor to conquer the Romans and set us free. But notice, they're so puzzled because we were hoping that Jesus, the miracle worker, the one who could open the eyes of the blind, the one who could make the lame walk again, that he was going to redeem Israel. What is more, it's the third day since all of this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb early this morning, but didn't find his body, just an empty tomb. They came and told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said he was alive. Then some of our companions went to the tomb and found it just as the woman had said, but they did not see Jesus. Now, Luke is recounting what Cleopas and this other unnamed disciple are telling Jesus about this events. They're like, yeah, this Jesus that we were so hoping was going to deliver us from Rome, but his body wasn't found. We saw him get crucified, but then these women came to us. They said the tomb is empty. Then some other disciples went over and they saw the tomb was empty too. We really don't know what happened. Now, here's the thing. It's in this moment, Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, is with these disciples. And this is one of the historical accounts of someone who saw Jesus. History tells us that over 500 people witnessed Jesus being resurrected. This is one of the earliest accounts. Now, it's in this moment, the resurrection has actually happened. Jesus is alive. He's standing there with them, listening to them. And yet, this truth and this reality is completely irrelevant to their lives. Now, here's what's happening. Jesus, here he is, resurrected, but they're just on the road to Emmaus. Nothing has changed much. Now, the reality is for many of us, I think this is a metaphor for much of our lives. The reality is Jesus did resurrect from the grave, but most of us are just walking along the road on our own journeys. Perhaps today, you're just the same thing with your life, your ups and downs, the hills and valleys that you might be going through. There's this lived reality that Jesus is actually resurrected from the dead. But it's just in our heads. It's something that we think about maybe once a year during Easter time, but it's not necessarily something that's actually infiltrated our hearts. And yet, Jesus is resurrected. It has happened. and yet it's deemed irrelevant. Last summer, I ended up getting a full body scan, and I found out that I have high cholesterol. Now, here's the thing, like, it was this moment of like, oh my goodness, how did this happen? And of course, when I told my wife at home, she's like, I know how it happened. Come on, we live next to Chick-fil-A. Like, you love fried food and red meat, and you don't like vegetables. I know exactly how it happened. Now, here's the thing. For most of my life, I've known that to be true, that a healthy, balanced diet with vegetables and fruits and all that stuff needs to accompany any kind of fatty meats and that sort of thing. And yet, it just, for whatever reason, it was irrelevant to me until all of a sudden, last summer, when it became incredibly relevant. Well, now I needed to watch my diet just so that I could become more aware of my health and what was happening. Now, the truth was always there. It's just it was irrelevant to my life. And in the same way for these disciples and for many of us in this room, like, Jesus is alive. But the question is, has it gone from your head to your heart? Has there come this moment when it's not just something to say on Easter Sunday, oh, he is risen indeed, but is it something that actually accesses the deepest parts of your heart, all of your longings and hopes and wishes and dreams, the decisions that you make in life? Has it reached that part of your life yet? Now, notice what happens. It says, he said to them, how foolish you are and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter into glory? Now, what's Jesus talking about here? Again, he's upending the ways that people thought about what God would be like. Because the way that the rest of the world is like is basically violence for violence. You overcome with power and might and military and money and strength. And yet Jesus is coming and he's basically saying, don't you see, like, the scriptures have always talked about how God doesn't transform with power and might over. He actually transforms with sacrifice and love and suffering. And notice what he says. Beginning with Moses and all the prophets, the Hebrew scriptures up to that point, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. He's walking through the story of scriptures from Genesis to Exodus and Moses, to the patriarchs, to the story of exile. He's going through the story and he's saying, don't you see the story from the beginning, the longings of the human heart, the need that each of us have for God, each of us have for the transcendent. Whenever we hit disappointment, whenever we hit moments of oppression or difficulty, it's in these moments, this story, the story of the people of God who are a broken people, are people who desperately need God. And in it, what Jesus is doing is he's basically pointing out in each of these historical accounts of how what it points to is the need for Jesus, the need for himself, and all of it. The scriptures are pointing to him. Now, some people are unaware that the scriptures are actually 66 books written over 1,500 years, over 40 different authors with different literary and historical contexts. And yet there's a singular thread that runs throughout each of these books if you've ever read the scriptures. And it's the thread, what Jesus is basically explaining, it's the thread of our desperate need for God. And Jesus is basically explaining, like, when it comes down to everything that the scriptures have to say, when it comes down to life and all of our grief, all of our joys, all of our longings, if there's one way to put it, at the end of the day, Christianity is not about a set of dogmas or about a book or about some sort of institutional structure or about ice cream trucks. It's about Jesus. But please join us for ice cream afterwards. It's always been about Jesus. And sometimes Christianity can get in the way of Jesus. And perhaps some of you, as you think about your own journey with faith, the heart of faith has always been about Jesus. And what Jesus is pointing out, even in the scriptures, all these stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the story of sacrifice, the story of Hagar, all of these stories have always been about Jesus. And Jesus is pointing out that the whole story of scriptures they point to him. It's about having a relationship with someone. Carl Madaris, he wrote a book, and one of the things that he writes out is sometimes we get so lost in Christianity, we miss out on Jesus. What if today the invitation for each one of us, wherever you are in life, whatever you're wrestling with, whatever you're going through, today was to meet Jesus? To just get to Jesus. Whatever grief and sorrow you carry, whatever hopes and joys you carry, that somehow the invitation is to get to Jesus. Now, notice what happens, because there comes a moment for these disciples when it does get from the head and into the heart. Look at what it says. It says, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened and they recognized him. Now, this word for recognize is the word epiginosko. Can I hear you say epiginosko? Turn to your neighbor and say, you better recognize. I've been waiting 3 services to say that. Turn to your other neighbor and say, you better epiginosko. Oh, what am I doing here? Anyhow, gnosko means to know intimately. Epi is actually a preposition that's added on top of gnosko. It's a deeper way of recognizing, of being in relationship with. And it's in this moment that an awakening occurs, an aha moment. It's this moment that just sticks out to them. And notice how they describe it. He disappeared from their sight. They asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us? There was this melting away of what was happening in our hearts while he walked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us. Wasn't there, while we were walking along, there was just this moment when everything about Jesus, it went from my head to my heart. When my heart was burning. And then I came to this recognition. In many ways, the invitation of Easter is for us to come to recognition. For the truth of the resurrection. Not to be just something out there or something that we celebrate once a year and we take some photos, but actually to be a lived reality that we're invited to. That it begins to change the texture of our lives, our perspectives, the ways that we view the world. For these disciples, their hearts were burning, and this recognition comes. It's no longer this irrelevant thing. It fundamentally changes their lives. All of us come to these moments in life, these puzzles and these moments in life where we're wondering, like, what is life? What is the meaning of life after death? What is the purpose for which I'm working all these hours? I mean, all of us come to these different moments that we're wrestling. Now, there's actually this other diagram that I'd love to show you. Here's a diagram. Now, notice at the top of the diagram, there's this arrow that is a sign for your life and mine, my life. I'm basically just journeying along. And perhaps whatever you've come in here with, all of the joys and sorrows that you've walked into this space today, March 31st, 2004, you've just been going about your life. This is the journey that you're on. You're along the way. And then what happens in my life is there's another Greek word there. The Greek word is kairos. There's this kairos moment that comes into play. Now, here's what kairos moments are. Kairos moments are these moments of awakening. Kairos is a word for time, but there's another word for time called chronos, which we get words like chronological from it. And whenever the word kairos is used differently because kairos is this moment that's like, it's a time that's pregnant with meaning. Like something is about to happen. Like there's something about my senses where I know that something is happening. Tina and I, my wife and I, we were friends for 2 years. And there was this moment when all of a sudden I realized that I started developing feelings for her. So here I was as someone like, we're purely platonic. And then there's this moment Kairos moment, baby, of just awakening. There it is. Some of you feel uncomfortable right now. I do too. But it was this moment of awakening. Now, God waited a few weeks to give her that Kairos moment, but nonetheless, it's a moment in time where it's just pregnant with meaning. It's full of awareness and awakening. And what God does is God gives us these moments as we're journeying through life. He gives us these moments of awakening. And the question for you and for me is, will you, in those moments, will you allow these Kairos moments to change the trajectory of your life and mine? Or will you just keep going along, business as usual? Or will it be a moment where you say, God, you've awakened something in me. I want to live now in light of the resurrection reality that you are alive. And because you're alive, it changes everything. Now, again, there's this circle here. It talks about repentance and reflection and then action. Will you reflect on it? In this moment, whatever you're doing with your life, will the resurrection be a lived reality where now all of a sudden you're like, something is happening in my life and in my heart? What would it look like now to live with this resurrection reality? When it comes to my anxieties, when it comes to my work, when it comes to my future, when it comes to my relationships, when it comes to my money, what will happen as I live in light of this resurrected reality? And the invitation is, there's these Kairos moments that are coming to you. Today could be your Kairos moment. Your moment of recognizing, your moment of awareness, your moment of when it gets from your head into your heart. Thomas Kuhn, he wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in this history of science, one of the things that he points out is that in the body of science, what often happens is there's these paradigms that are created. For instance, there was a paradigm at one point that this was an Earth-centered kind of solar system and universe, and the sun revolved around the Earth. And one of the things he says is what happens is there are these anomalies, these learnings that come that are anomalies. They're just outside of the system. And what these anomalies do is they disrupt the system, and what happens is these paradigms get fundamentally shifted. And so in the history of science, what happens is scientific revolutions occur as a result of this. So one of those scientific revolutions is the Copernican revolution. The idea now that the sun is actually the center and the earth revolves around the sun. Now, what in the world? I mean, could you imagine how mind-blowing that was to people? And so this idea of these revolutions come when these anomalies come. Like, this is what the resurrection is. It's this moment of just extraordinary, what an anomaly. And the question is for each one of us is, will we allow this anomaly to end up changing fundamentally the trajectory of your life and mine? This is what the resurrection was. We sit in this room because thousands of years ago, Jesus resurrected from the grave. The question is, will you allow that to change your life and mine? Now, here's the question. When does this moment of recognition come for these disciples? Because it comes at a particular time. They're on the road with him, but something happens that causes them to recognize. Look at what it says. It says, when he was at the table with them, Jesus, he took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and then they recognized him. And notice, when they're recounting this to other disciples, look at what they say. Then the two told the disciples what had happened on the way and how Jesus was recognized by them when what? When he broke the bread. Now, what's so significant about breaking the bread? Why is it that moment that this is what they're highlighting? Oh my goodness, this was the moment of awareness that came to us. The moment where our lives would fundamentally change was when he broke the bread. Well, see, look at what happens on the night before Jesus died. Look at what the text tells us. Jesus was with his disciples. He took the bread, he gave thanks, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, saying, "This is my body given for you. Eat this in remembrance of me." See, it all starts to click together for these disciples. The reason Jesus died was so that he could die on the cross for me and for you on our behalf, that we might experience God in a fundamentally different way than people have been taught that what God is like. God is some cosmic killjoy who's out to get you and out to kill your fun. And yet through the person of Jesus, what we experience is that God is actually a God of incredible, infinite love who would give his life away for you and for me. And it's in this moment of awakening that the disciples recognize this is why Jesus came. When he broke the bread, it was a reminder of who Jesus is and who Jesus has always been. The one who would give his life for you because he loves you. This is the moment of recognition, of deeply knowing who God is. Do you know this about God? Do you know that God loves you enough that whatever you're going through right now, that he would give his life for you? So that whatever you might encounter in this world, whatever darkness, whatever fear, whatever anxiety, whatever loneliness, whatever depression, whatever grief, that you might know that there's a God in heaven who loves you and would give his life for you. See, there's a mantra in the early church that the Apostle Paul talks about. In the book of Romans, in the letter to the church in Rome, he would say this phrase when reflecting on who God is. He would say, if God is for us, who can be against us? If God is for you, even in death, who can be against you? Whatever you might be carrying in today, whatever fears, anxiety, griefs, worries, even if it's death itself, and this is why the early church, against persecution and death, this was their mantra. If God is for us, then even if I die, I can live. When I entrust my life to a loving God, then whatever fears or hopes, if God is for us, then what can Rome do to us? If God is for us, then what can depression do to us? If God is for us, what can the Boston Celtics, no, I'm just kidding. If God is for us, who can be against us? And this would fundamentally change the course of human history, a people who knew that Jesus was alive. And if God is for us, who can be against us?